major romantic critics. There are Victorian critics like Matthew Arnold, Oscar Wilde, Walter Pater, who have debate about function of poetry or aesthetic pleasures gained through literature. So, social function and aesthetic function, that is a debate in the theories of late 19th or Victorian era. We are not discussing those theories because they are not mostly included in BSR master's program. And we move to one of the most significant modern critic, T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot, an American born poet who later on migrated to England and adopted his British nationality and converted to Catholic Christianity. Eliot was a cultural and literary force throughout the 1920s and 1930s. You can say that's the time of high modernism. As editor of the Quarterly, the Criterion, until the journal's demise in 1939, Eliot published leading English modernists, including Virginia Woolf and James Joyce, and he was the first to publish in English such significant European writers as Jean Cocteau and Marcel Proust, the leading novelist of Stream of Consciousness. In 1925, Eliot accepted a position in the firm of Faber and Goer, later called Faber and Faber, which became a leading publisher of poets from Ezra Pound to Sylvia Plath. He wrote plays like Murder in the Cathedral and The Cocktail Party, besides his poetry, The Wasteland, The Four Quarter, The Ash Wednesday. In 1927, Eliot became a British citizen and joined the Church of England. In the following year, he announced in a collection of critical essays that was classicist in literature, royalist in politics, and Anglo-Catholic in religion. Our first selection, tradition and individual talent, begins in English writing. We seldom speak of tradition. The poise and authority of Eliot's critical voice, backed up by his masterful performance as a poet, as a key poet, critic, intellectual, teacher of literature, two of the canonical texts of modern Anglo-American literary criticism, mean F.R. Lewis, Revaluation, and Clank Brooks' Modern Poetry and Tradition, were expansions of Eliot's ideas about tradition. Eliot believes that each poem exists within the tradition from which it takes the shape, and which in turn it redefines the poetry. Thus, tradition is both something to which the poet must be faithful and something that poet actively makes. Novelty emerges out of being steeped in tradition rather than a revolt against tradition. Eliot has also been criticized for picturing tradition as variously a simultaneous order, a living whole, an ideal order, and the mind of Europe, thereby idealizing its conflicts, contradictions, and omissions. Metaphysical poetry is another central work in the history of modern criticism. Almost soon as it appeared, the difficult 17th century metaphysical poets, John Donne, Andrew Marvell, and their contemporaries, whom Eliot described as more often named than read, and more often read than profitably studied, became models of good poetry. So poets who were ignored for more than 2 centuries, they were revalued by T.S. Eliot in his essay, Metaphysical Poets. Eliot's essay is concerned in its argument, highly suggestive and extraordinarily ambitious. In his essay, he deploys the evaluative terms that in the 18th century, Johnson had used against the metaphysical poets. Johnson condemned the metaphysical poets being the most heterogeneous ideas yoked by violence together. But Eliot used this term to elevate the very poets whom his eminent precursor had assailed. Eliot packs the metaphysical poets with unelaborated argument and assertion, stressing in particular the 17th century's disastrous dissociation of sensibility into thought and feeling. In the process, Eliot illustrates how tradition is made, how tradition is forced into the form that later generations of writers require. Many of Eliot's readers took his generalization as literal truths, and even skeptics such as the English critic Frank Kermode judged that refuting English demanded full-scale scholarly and critical demonstration. So that's his position as an intellectual and a learned scholar, which makes it difficult for others to criticize him. Eliot is also called a troublemaker, saying outrageous things from on high and often not quite clarifying whether he meant them seriously. For example, he wrote an essay, Hamlet and His Problems. In this essay, Eliot presents his brilliant theory of objective correlative, and he claims that Hamlet lacks that objective correlity, and because of this shortcoming, he calls Hamlet as an artistic failure. So we can say Eliot created that type of trouble, that type of, you can say, sensations even through his ideas, which were not taken so much seriously in his writings overall. In his essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, he makes certain claims. First is, which we have just read, in English writing, we seldom speak of tradition, though we occasionally apply its name in deploring its absence. Then he says, every nation, every race has not only its own creative, but its own critical turn of mind, and is even more oblivious of the shortcomings and limitation of its critical habits than those of its creative genius. We know or think we know from the enormous mass of critical writing that has appeared in French language, the critical method or habit of the French. It means the English poets, they are more aware of the French tradition and they are less aware of the English tradition. One of the facts that might come to light in this process is our tendency to insist upon those aspects of his work in which he least resembles anyone else. I mean, they try to focus on individuality of the poet. But according to Eliot, individuality comes later. First is trace out poet's position in continuity of tradition. We dwell with satisfaction upon poet's difference from his predecessor, especially his immediate predecessor, and we endeavor to find something that can be isolated in order to be enjoyed. यानी किसी पोइट को लोग जो हैं वो वैल्यू करते वक्त ये कहते हैं ये बाकियों से मुख्तलिफ है, बाकियों से हटकर है, ये नया है, ये ओरिजिनल है, और इस बुनियाद पर उसको रेट करते हैं हाई. According to Eliot, that is not the appropriate mechanism. We have seen many such simple currents soon lost in the sand, and novelty is better than repetition. Tradition is a matter of much wider significance. It cannot be inherited, and if you want it, you must obtain it by great labor. That is one of his quotations. कि ट्रेडिशन जो होती है वो इनहेरिट नहीं की जाती, बल्कि आपको पूरी मेहनत और कोशिश से हासिल करना पड़ती है. ट्रेडिशन इन्वॉल्व्स द हिस्टोरिकल सेंस which we may call nearly indispensable to anyone who would continue to be a poet. जो कोई भी शायर बनना चाहे तो उसके लिए जरूरी है कि वो हिस्टोरिकल सेंस यानी तारीखी शऊर हासिल करे, जो पोइट के लिए एलियट के मुताबिक नागजीर है. Historical sense involves a perception not only of the pastness of the past but of its presence. Very important line कि तारीखी शऊर का मतलब ये नहीं है कि वो माजी को जानता हो, बल्कि pastness of its presence को जाने. Pastness of its presence, which means how past is related to present and in what way it is affecting present world. Historical sense compels a man to write not merely with his own generation in his bones, but with the feeling that the whole of the literature from Homer and within it the whole of the literature of his own country has a simultaneous existence and composes a simultaneous order. Historical sense, which is the sense of the timeless as well as the temporal. Timeless means universal and temporal means within specific time, and of the timeless and of the temporal together. You can say that's a paradoxical statement कि historical sense जो है वो उसका वो timeless भी है और temporal भी है और दोनों का blend भी है. No poet, no artist of any art has his complete meaning alone. यानी कोई आर्टिस्ट जो है तन्हा उसकी कोई हैसियत ही नहीं है, ये एलिट का ख्याल है. इसको आप उस ख्याल के साथ जोड़ें कि जो हम रोमांटिक ख्यालात की ट्रेडिशन में देखते हैं कि पोइट शुड एक्सप्रेस हिज फीलिंग्स. इंडिविजुअलिटी इज फोकस हियर, इंडिविजुअलिटी इज मेड सेकेंडरी. Poet's significance, his appreciation is the appreciation of his relation to the dead poets and artists. You cannot value him alone. You must set him for contrast and comparison among the dead. Dead mean the poet of the past. The necessity that he shall confirm, that he shall cohere, is not one-sided. Existing order is complete before the new work arrives, for order to persist after this supervention of novelty. In particular sense, he will be aware also that he must inevitably be judged by the standards of the past. That is his idea, that poet of present should be judged by the standards of the past. I say judged by them, not judged to be as good as our words are better than the dead. Certainly not judged by the canons of dead critics. It is a judgment, a comparison in which two things are measured by each other. To confirm merely would be for the new work, not really to conform at all. यानी ये नए वर्क की प्लेस बनाने के लिए है, ना कि पुराने जो आइडियाज हैं उनकी कंफर्मेशन के लिए नहीं होता। The poet must be very conscious of the main current, which main current means flow of tradition, which does not at all flow invariably through the most distinguished reputation. He must be quite aware of the obvious fact that art never improves. That is very controversial, you can say, statement. Art never improves, but that the material of art is never quite the same. यानी कि मटेरियल ऑफ आर्ट तो इम्प्रूव होता रहता है, लेकिन आर्ट इट सेल्फ इम्प्रूव नहीं होता। ये एक डिबेटेबल पॉइंट है। एलियट का पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू यही है कि यानी जिन बेसिस पे होमर को आइडियलाइज किया गया था, आज भी किसी पोइट को आइडियलाइज करने की वही बेस होगी। आर्ट डज नॉट इम्प्रूव, बट मटीरियल ऑफ आर्ट improves. He must be aware that the mind of Europe, the mind of his own country, a mind which he learns in time to be much more important than his own private mind. यानी कि socio political collective consciousness is more important than individual consciousness of poetry. Then he says, poet must develop or procure the consciousness of the past, and that he should continue to develop his consciousness throughout his career. The progress of an artist is a continual self-sacrifice, continual extinction of personality. Again, a very debatable point कि आर्टिस्ट जो है वो अपने काम से हमेशा अपने आप को खारिज करता रहे, उसको एक्सटिंक्ट करता रहे। Three remains to define, they remains to define this process of depersonalization and its relation to the sense of tradition. It is in this depersonalization art may be said to approach the condition of science. I therefore invite you to consider as a suggestive analogy the action which takes place when a bit of finely filiated platinum is introduced into a chamber containing oxygen and sulfur dioxide. That's the example of catalyst. He thinks that mind of the poet is the shred of platinum. It may partly or exclusively operate upon the experience of the man himself, but the more perfect the artist, the more completely separate in him will be the man who suffers and the mind which creates. The more perfectly will the mind digest and transmute passions. Great poetry may be made without the direct use of any emotional, whatever composed out of feeling solely. That is complete negation of Wordsworthian idea of poetry. Poetry is spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. So, according to him, poetry may be made without direct use of any emotion, whatever, composed out of feeling solely. According to Eliot, poetry is not, yeah, Bad poet is usually unconscious where he out to be conscious, and conscious where he out to be unconscious. Both errors tend to make him person. Poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. Poetry is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality. But of course, only those who have personality and emotions know what it means to want to escape from these things. So these are important points which are mentioned in his essay. Uh, Tradition and individual talent mean poet should not be present in his work. Art does not improve. Mind of the poet is like the mind of the catalyst, mean which is important, but it great art is where poet is, artist is missing in his work.